COVID, the biggest crime against humanity. 30th of the 7th, 2024. It is astonishing to me that many of the general public have completely forgotten the things that occurred during the pandemic. A government so utterly filled with confidence and malice completely weaponised the fear of the general public to advance state control and breach human rights in ways no other government has done in decades. What started out as murmurings of a public health emergency quickly gave the government exactly what they wanted, the mandate of control. The same politicians sitting in Parliament and Congress nowadays lock down citizens in a method that can only be described as solitary confinement, as classified by the UN, though of course never sanctioned or questioned. In fact, on the contrary, the mainstream media, which over the past couple of years has been totally bought out by the bloated arms of the state, constantly push an agenda to convince citizens to throw their rights away for the sake of safety. According to the BMJ, the COVID death rate sits at 0.66% and the survival rate provided by full fact at 99.76%. And based off this, we can determine that the government had no authority or mandate to enact any form of excess state control. During COVID, we were constantly lied to and told that the hospitals are full, when in reality, nurses and doctors spent their time dancing for TikToks in near empty emergency rooms, while people's grandparents died away from their family in a single bed, surrounded by foreign workers. The state gave these people absolutely no dignity in death. Not only that, but people experiencing serious medical emergencies were consistently told there was no help because of COVID, despite all of the hospitals being totally empty. Then, there was the mass brainwashing of the state-owned media companies and the eerily named Unit 77 Brigade, who set on a determined mission to totally reduce the population to mass psychosis and fear through the biggest psyop ever performed for decades. The media companies, for instance, used botched statistics that gave absurdly incorrect death and infection data, and some statistics even calculated deaths for any reason post-COVID diagnosis. Meaning someone could get in a car crash and die, but if they were diagnosed with COVID the week prior, their death would be considered a COVID death. What's scary about this is COVID the week prior that their death would... Okay. What's scary about this is that their state PSYOP agencies were strong enough to cover the lying eyes of all its citizens. But eventually, excess deaths did come, however, not from the COVID boogeyman as the state would have you believe. Rather, they appeared after the lockdowns, and interestingly enough, were overrepresented in those who had been vaccinated against COVID. Young, fit, healthy people were and still are dying constantly, not from COVID, but from random heart problems that seemingly come out of nowhere, until of course, all of our suspicions were confirmed when myocarditis was directly linked to the COVID vaccine. Do not be fooled by any talk of doing what was right for the greater good, or politicians calling for a COVID amnesty. What they did to us was criminal and must never be forgotten. The lockdowns, for instance, increased mental illness and suicide rates dramatically according to the University of Bristol. Rates of people experiencing anxiety conditions doubled, and according to the BBC and Samaritans, suicide and severe depression increased to 1/3 of the population. This doesn't even mention the effects this had on children, as it stunted their development, with some parents saying their children exhibit autism-like symptoms post-pandemic. Children post-pandemic struggled to communicate and understand facial expressions due to both the masks and the lockdowns preventing them from communicating with people. According to the BBC, in an article where a nurse describes the effects of the lockdown in relation to children, she says, we are seeing children who have got basically all of their sound system disordered. Describing the child in the article, the BBC wrote, Ivy, who has now been diagnosed with speech dyspraxia, is having to unlearn many inaccurate speech patterns she learned during the pandemic. The scale and effect of this horrific authoritarian experiment on the part of the state to see how much their citizens will abdicate their rights to a global order has been nothing short of a crime against humanity, and the vaccine excess deaths equate to nothing more than mass medicalised genocide on a global scale. The global elite understand this and are constantly suppressing the true scale and inhuman tactics used during this time, a scale which will only be released when every single person involved has passed on, so that no one is held accountable for this blatant and disgusting crime against humanity. We must never let anyone forget what they did to us, and we must see this as a lesson to constantly question authority and create protections against state control. Never forget what they did to you, and never let them forget either.